quietly and without avoiding distraction. And I invite the rest of you to join us after the presentation for a Q&A with our guest speaker today. I'm very excited to be able to introduce you to Dr. Maylei Blackwell, who is joining us today from the University of California, Los Angeles, where she's a faculty member in the Department of Finance and Chicano Studies and contributes to various programs and departments. She's here today to share her very exciting research on transnational feminist activism. I ask you to join me in giving a really warm welcome to Dr. Blackwell, who's joining us in Colgate here today. I think this one is on. Okay.
Hi. It's beautiful to see you all. The weather's really nice here. I thought it was going to be horrible. And the food is really good. Those brownies. I would come here just to eat a brownie. Let's see. I don't get all the technology situated. All right. So I want to share a talk with you called Geographies of Difference. Cautionary Tales from Transnational Feminist Travels. My name is Serna, even though I can't really see that far. And so I want to begin today by recognizing that we're on indigenous land. I think this is the ancestral home of the Oneida. And recognize all the indigenous peoples who've been guardians and keepers of this land that we're going to school around talking, working on, the Haudenosaunee people. And I also want to begin with the caveat that although I'm standing here today and I'm sharing with you what I've learned, that what I'm sharing is grounded in my participation and my work accompanying different transnational social movements over the past 2 decades. So what I'm going to share with you includes indigenous women's organizing from Mexico and across Abya Yala. Abya Yala is a word. See, you've already learned something new today. How many of you know Abya Yala? Okay, so it's this continent in purple here. It's a Kuna word, and the Kuna are indigenous people of Panama and Colombia, and that's their concept for thinking about how indigenous people and how all of us are connected, all of us that live on this hemisphere. There are seats in the front. I've also accompanied Chicana feminists and Mexican and women in the Mexican American Civil Rights Movement, and early women of color groups here on the East Coast and West Coast, like the Third World Women's Alliance, and Mexican and Chicana farm workers in California. Most recently, I've been working with cross-border organizers in Los Angeles who are Zapotec and Mixtec, so they come from the southern Oaxacan state, southern Mexican state of Oaxaca. And that's all to say that the insights that I'm sharing with you today are part of the collective knowledge of many communities, many lessons, many communities in struggle. And I want to share with you what I've uncovered about the alternative genealogies or histories and herstories, the sources and practices of feminism, and some cautionary tales, right, about all these different adventures across what I've called underlying geographies of difference. So the easiest way for me to kind of tell you about all these histories and movements is to share the cautionary tales that I've learned over the past 15 or 20 years. So, I'm turning my volume up. Okay. So geographies of differences is like the most, there's kind of 2 dense ideas in this talk. I'm going to hit you with the first one first. So what we're calling transnational feminism is really a response and a redo of earlier notions of global sisterhood. So early and second wave feminism, many people thought about global sisterhood as, a kind of universal sisterhood uniting women across the globe based on gender oppression. And so what was wrong with that picture? Any ideas? Global sisterhood, why didn't it work? Yeah.
They don't account to personal oppressions or how different women around the world are based on maybe the economic status of their country or where they are.
Okay, great. So the idea of global sisterhood privileges gender but erases other differences, like between first world and third world, between different races, between different sexual orientations, between different citizenship statuses. So exactly, so transnational feminism is part of what one possible route to navigate the flow of power and capital and people, and how all those different flows shape differently how political actors can organize in the world. And those shifting differences is what I'm calling geographies of difference. So I'm talking about this because when I began the work in the 1990s, there was a kind of acritical celebration of global civil society that people were hoping was some kind of magical counterweight to what was happening in relationship to the globalization of capital. And what that overlooked is that the way that capital was organizing exacerbated existing power relationships. So geographies of difference then helps us think about how when people, capital, cultures cross borders with growing frequency, effective transnational organizers not only cross borders with those forms of power, but negotiate the borders of race, class, and gender, exactly what your fellow student just talked about. So I use geographies of difference to talk about how differently situated actors come together to fight a shared set of conditions, but they have to navigate their collective project from the way they experience those conditions in unique and contextual ways. Geographies of difference also describes how social movement actors, even in the same social group, so women, for example, may be positioned differently by structures and experiences of multiple and intersecting oppressions. What we've been talking about, race, class, gender, indigeneity, sexual difference, citizenship status, right? So we know from studying cases of violence against women, if you're an undocumented woman, you might not be able to report the violence that's happening to you because you're afraid of the police, right? Or you're afraid of having your family split up. So that's different from women who have citizenship. And then the third way describing geographies of difference is to talk about how national and local power systems are structured differently and must be taken into account when engaging both local network and transnational or trans-local organizing. That's a lot of social movement speak. We're talking about how before organizers go to organize globally, they have to navigate what kind of power is happening locally, right? So people, when they were waiting for those magical movements to, counter globalization, didn't account for how women of color, for example, have to navigate the local power relationships in the U.S. before they can even reach the transnational or international level. Okay, so these ways of transnational feminism and seeing geographies of difference is the corrective to this earlier iteration of global sisterhood. And that kind of leads us to my second lesson. Hopefully I'm not. And the second lesson I'm sharing from the different tales of transnational feminist travels. These are pictures from the Latin American Feminist Encuentro, 2009, apparently, I can't remember. And this is the first time transgender women were allowed into the Feminist Encuentro, right? And there was a lot of lively debate. Are trans women? Are they feminists? Can they participate in our movement? And so what I think is important here is to disrupt what I call U.S. globalized scripts of liberation, right? So what happens is that oftentimes in the U.S., the narratives of liberation that we've created, like Stonewall, do you all know what the Stonewall Rebellion is? A few of you. So to review, for those of you who don't, a lot of, like, the discourse of gay pride is based on the idea of the Stonewall Rebellion, the 1969 rebellion, where people were getting really sick of the cops who would come in and harass and sometimes beat up patrons of, the gay and lesbian and transgender bars. They would often take bribes, right? And people rebelled, right? So it was a rebellion against the kind of police corruption. And so when that discourse circulates as the birth of the modern LGBT movement, oftentimes what's erased is that it was Puerto Rican and Black transgender women who beat those cops up with their high heel shoes, right? And that's a little bit different than the mainstream LGBT narrative that we hear. But what happens when that narrative circulates globally is it not only erases people of color and working class people and trans people's experience in the US, it also begins to replace local or indigenous forms of gender and sexuality. So for example, where I work in Latin America, people start talking about LGBT, right? They start talking about LGBT and discourses of orgullo, right? Discourses of pride. And what that erases is that in Mexico, there's still indigenous cultures with their multiple gender systems, right? So many people don't understand that it was part of colonization that brought the dual gender system, male, female, that there's only two genders, right? As part of Catholic, the Hispanicization and the Catholicization. I don't think that's the word, but of Latin America. That kind of forced people to pick one of the other genders. But some indigenous cultures still have their multiple gender systems intact, right? We know the Navajo had 33 different genders before contact, right? The Dene. And the Zapotec still have their third gender category. So the Zapotec are an indigenous group in Oaxaca. And this group is mostly, you see these third gender folks mostly around the isthmus of Oaxaca, and they're known as the Muxe. So here at the Encuentro, one of the most famous Muxe activists is here in her traditional huipil or her traditional blouse. So if we took the discourse of gay pride, and what happens is that we think we invented it in the US, and we think that we're doing it the best, and so we're going to go show other people in the world how to do it, right? And what that misses, like I tell my students all the time, what they fail to realize is if we're kind of stuck on our own narrative, is that Latin America is actually doing better on LGBT rights than the US, right? They have passed marriage rights before the US did. They have passed, they've had very innovative kinds of protests and work. And so one of the examples I give is the Marcha Lesbica, or the Lesbian March, that was organized by the Comay. How many Spanish speakers are there in here? Okay, so this is kind of only funny to people who speak Spanish, but I'll break down the joke. So I don't know if you knew this, but in Spanish, lesbians are often referred to as tortilleras, women who make tortillas, and you can theorize why later over a cocktail. Right? But so the organizing committee called itself the Comal, right? It's the thing that makes the tortillas hot, like the grill you put them on, which is kind of funny, you know, if you're thinking about it. So it was trying to make a whole movement of lesbians, warm them up, right? Get them ready for this, what they're calling every kiss is a revolution, right? That was their slogan. So the Marcha Lesbica is an interesting way to think about how people are contesting these globalized scripts of liberation, because they decided they didn't want to celebrate gay pride in June, right? Because they considered that somewhat of an imperialist imposition from the U.S. LGBT movement that's been adopted around the world somewhat acritically. Hey, Bruin in the house, I like your hat. And the interesting thing is they decided to organize their first march in March of 2003, and they were the first ever lesbian march. It was attended by 2,500 people, which is a pretty good march. The only other march in Latin America that exists like this is in Brazil. And if you listen to how they talked about it, they said after 25 years of organizing, so they'd already been active for 25 years, they needed, quote, autonomous spaces that do not compromise our ethics in the construction of a society that is critical of heterosexism, neoliberalism, and other fundamentalisms through the first lesbian march of Mexico and Latin America. So they wanted to have their critique both about homophobia, but also about economic oppression and globalization. They also said, we want as lesbians to have a public voice that is autonomous, heterogeneous, positive, and free. The march will be an expression of our rebellious spirits as lesbians. Right, and so you can see. And they also helped to coordinate other actions that if we only bought this globalized script, we would miss. So Mexico City was one of the first cities in Latin America to get a kind of gay marriage covenant. And the activists did it by organizing a massive kiss-in instead of a sit-in. You know, people just get together and make out. Yeah, you could try that. I heard you guys had a sit-in last year. Now you can move on and many other kinds of inns. So the kissing was at this really historic site, the Palacio de Bellas Artes, the Fine Arts Palace. And that's how they began, right? So we want to kind of pull back our own assumptions about the U.S. primacy. Like, we're the ones who know how to make democracy in the world, make gay liberation, make, feminism. So if we pull back that assumption, we get to see these other movements. And this is really important because it helps us see other histories. When I first got to UCLA, there were people, I have to admit, professors in my own department, who were saying that feminism was a European import to Latin America and to Chicano Latino communities. Ooh, yes, right? So what that misses is that there's history since the 1880s of Latin American feminism, right? The first Mexican Congress was organized, the Mexican Feminist Congress was organized in the 1913, I believe, the Yucatan Feminist Congress, and Argentina and Uruguay. The people were organizing since the 1880s, right, around feminism, calling themselves feminists. So we want to make sure we're getting to see those other alternative genealogies. And that leads us to my third cautionary tale, is that besides deconstructing these globalized scripts of liberation that are coming from the north and flowing south is our assumption. We need to think about maybe they're coming from the south and flowing north. We want to understand alternative origin stories or genealogies of resistance and participation. For example, if we start to talk about how marginalized people have accessed the international system or the United Nations system, right? Like the first kind of globalized movements were around anti-slavery. They were around women's suffrage, right? But they also were around indigenous rights. And right here, we don't even realize that right here in the territory that you're in, it was the Mohawk, right? The Mohawk Nation who appealed to the League of Nations before the UN even existed to try to become members of the League of Nations. And they did so because the Canadian government and the US government were collaborating to try to eradicate their legal basis for their land and sovereignty. And they realized, like, if we only get to come to the occupying government for justice, we're probably not going to get justice, right? So they were looking for an international arena to do that. And there are really important cases of that Mohawk petition to the League of Nations. Different Mohawk speakers traveled to Europe to speak on the condition of the red man, as they called it at the time. And so there are other kinds of transnationalism. So if you think about how indigenous nations are nations, right, and they're nations within nations, they already have a long history of practicing transnationalism. Even the kinds of treaty making they made with the US government is a kind of transnationalism. And we know, here I'm giving you the example of, in the 1970s, during the American Indian movement, there was so much violent repression of the American Indian movement and incarceration of indigenous political prisoners like Leonard Peltier. They decided to form the International Treaty Council and to take their claims to the United Nations, right? So some of the work that I'm doing and part of the Indigenous Women's Organizing International, it comes from feminism, but it also comes from other international movements, and that we have to kind of pay attention to these other histories. And for me, it's important because this Treaty Council had worked with other people internationally through the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Populations, and they worked so much and so hard, they finally, after decades and decades, like 3 decades, got the UN Declaration of Indigenous Peoples passed in 2007, right? And that UN, what's called the UN DRIP, is really important because it codifies, even though the US is not a signatory to it, it codifies an international law, it creates a norm of the way indigenous rights should be respected. And so the other thing about alternative genealogies is that oftentimes we look at feminism or transnational feminism as something that happens abroad, in India, in Africa, right? And we don't understand that transnational feminism has shaped the way feminism is practiced in the US. And so I point to the Third World Women's Alliance. So how many of you have ever heard of SNCC? SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee? Okay, so one of the major student arms of the civil rights movement. in the South, right, in the Black Civil Rights Movement. But how many of you knew there was a New York chapter? Okay, so the New York chapter of SNCC had eventually formed a Black Women's Liberation Committee because they wanted to know what is the role of gender within racial justice. And what they found is that they got a lot of static from the other SNCC members, so they broke off of SNCC and they began to organize in the community. And when they did that, they pretty soon found other women, Puerto Rican women, who shared a similar agenda and discourse. And what they started to realize is that their connection to third world solidarity helped them think about how to become allies in the U.S. So what I'm saying is that they used a transnational or third world imaginary, right? And we're going to talk about the role of imagination, right? You can't really create liberation and create social justice from the point you're at. You have to imagine this different world that could be possible, right? So they used how they were inspired by third world liberation movements in Cuba and Angola, and how movements in Vietnam and Asia and Africa were overthrowing their colonial rulers. And they were inspired by women in Nicaragua and Cuba and women who were at the forefront of those movements. And they became so inspired by it, they looked at it as a model to create coalition between themselves. They said, hey, these are all third world peoples. And as third world peoples, we're united against imperialism, against colonialism. And so that means that's a different kind of sisterhood that recognizes that although we're all oppressed or have been oppressed by processes of colonization, that we can find commonality. And so a lot of people don't understand that that is part of the basis of women of color feminism in the U.S. We usually understand women of color feminism as a critique of nationalism, and Black nationalism, or in the Chicano power movement, is what I've written about. Or it's sometimes a critique of racism in the women's liberation movement. But what's erased is this third root, right? The transnational root of women of color feminism that's linked to the third world liberation struggles. And so this is how people were inspired by something happening globally, and they localized that experience to their own communities to think about how they could organize together in the workplace for better wages, or talk about sterilization, right? This is a time in feminism where one of the major demands was for abortion rights. And women of color, American Indian women, who in the 1970s and 80s, 1/4 of all American Indian women were being sterilized by the Indian Health Services. And they figured out that that was part of colonialism, right? That eradication, that was a continuum of genocide. And they started to organize with Puerto Rican women, who are also, I think, 1/3 of the entire island of Puerto Rico. At one point, the women were sterilized. And they're like, wait a minute, what's going on? And so within the frame of third world liberation, we find other kinds of feminism. We find feminism that puts sterilization on the table and expands our notion of reproductive justice, not just to abortion, but to include other kinds of reproductive health and the right to reproduce and the right not to be sterilized, right? So the roots, these other roots of transnational feminism are important to even get a complete understanding of feminism in the U.S. itself. Okay, so did I cover all this? I wasn't even looking. Okay, this is one of the more trickier lessons I'm going to share. Oh no, it's not. Okay. This gets back to how people, U.S. feminists, are being inspired by international ideas and transnational imaginaries. So this gets back to some of the earliest feminists in Mexico were part of the leading protests that led to the Mexican Revolution. They began to organize in the 1890s and the 1900s to call an end to the dictatorship of Porfirio Diaz. They were also part of the Mexican, the Partido Liberal Mexicano, the liberal, Mexican Liberal Party, that's what they call it in English, and they were called the Hijas de Cuauhtémoc. Does anyone know who Cuauhtémoc was? You're learning something today, besides getting food. Okay, so Cuauhtémoc is important in Mexican history because Cuauhtemoc was the last Aztec emperor to not cede power to the Spanish during conquest. So the idea of being a daughter of Cuauhtemoc, it's kind of like Daughters of the American Revolution, or it's referring to this other historical frame. So when I started to look at this, I realized this is a kind of what I refer to as retrofitted memory, using the women in Mexico and the feminism of Mexico. And we know that, there was feminists in Japan, there were feminists at this time, right? That there were feminists all over the world. And so Chicanas, when they were organizing in Los Angeles and throughout the Southwest in the 1960s, as part of a student movement, it started in LA in 1968, in East LA, where Dr. Serna is from, right there. I think you went to high school there, right? Where 10,000 high school students walked out, right? And we never hear about that. And we don't even hear about all the women that were involved. And when the women began to get organized, the guys would say, oh, that's a white thing, feminism, or that you're being ugly and badass, whitewashed, or you're being a malinche. That's another figure you need to learn about at some point, right? The so-called Mexican Eve, people pin the downfall of Mexico on this one figure, Malintzin. Right, so that's convenient narrative. And they were saying, no, that feminism is part of our culture. But they wouldn't have been able to make that claim unless they thought about what it was in Latin America, what is feminism in Mexico, what were women in the Mexican Revolution. And so this is an important idea, is that transnational ideas were forming U.S. feminism. And so that was the basis of the book I published before called Chicana Power, Contested Histories of Feminism in the Chicano Movement. And so it's just to illustrate this idea that transnational ideas and transnational feminism have been localized. And so it's not just to be inspired by the Arab Spring or by something going on internationally, it's to localize that meaning. What does it mean in our current context? How do we use that idea here at home in our communities? And so this is the more trickier lesson. Okay, so you know how we've been talking about largely women's rights, women fighting for their rights. What I started to learn from the indigenous women's movement in Mexico is that rights discourse, using rights to claim our freedom, can be both emancipatory, it can lead to liberation, but it also can be regulatory. It can really start to regulate who deserves freedom and who doesn't. Okay. So let me tell you a story. How many of you have heard about the Zapatista rebellion? Anyone? Okay, good number. So in 1994, the Zapatista Army of National Liberation had a rebellion on January 1st, 1994. Why January 1st? Does anyone know? Yeah. Yeah, it was the day exactly that the North American Free Trade Agreement, you all are so smart, was going to go into effect. Thank you. So they were protesting free trade and the way free trade agreements impacted indigenous communities in Mexico, right? Because the Mexican government was walking around saying, hey, NAFTA is going to bring us into the first world. And they're like, hey, we don't even have running water. Our kids are dying of cholera. Right, our kids are dying of curable diseases. We don't have health care. We don't have education. So when they had their rebellion, part of the newspapers that were being handed out at the time to explain what their agenda was, what their platform was, included the Women's Revolutionary Law, right? And because women had been organized within the Zapatistas before they made themselves public on January 1st. And so the Mexican government said, oh, this is evidence that this is feminist infiltrators from the outside. This must not be an indigenous movement, right? So because indigenous people had a women's platform, they said, this is proof, with all these other kind of racist reasons, like they did it on January 1st, which is the day people usually party, and the fact that it happened so early in the morning is evidence that it wasn't indigenous, because indigenous people can't get it together to go have a rebellion that early in the morning. They actually said that. They said this must be Guatemalan, guerrillas come to fight. So besides all these other racist reasons for the Mexican government to deny that this was a truly indigenous rebellion, they pointed to the women's rights agenda. So, but the contradiction, well, one, you could question the Mexican states, like feminism, you know, you're like, okay, so you never cared about this until right now, and suddenly, you know, indigenous people want their rights. And so what's interesting about this is that we start to see how gender is a discourse that's been very effective. So when I showed you the Latin American feminist encuentros, they've been happening for 30 years. The feminist movement in Latin America is very vibrant, it's very successful. And it's been used by a lot of, you know, now there's women's ministries within the government. And the problem is that sometimes you can become a victim of your own success, right? Because the state and the governments then practice and meet your demands, which is awesome. But sometimes they translate those demands into other kinds of things, right? So feminists started to talk about how gender rights have been co-opted by states and turned instead of a practice of liberation into a technocratic language. So to give an example, so women wanted to call attention to violence against women in the home. But once it became a kind of bureaucratic thing in state practice or in the Ministry for Women's Affairs, for example, it would be called the law against interfamilial violence. Okay, so that's okay. You know, you don't want people in one family beating each other up. But it totally takes out the analysis of patriarchy, right? That one gender has power over another, and that's part of what authorizes injustice, right? That's part of what authorizes or makes violence okay, is that men are seen as, or husbands before feminists. This was the, you know, one of the many feminist problems that had no name, right? Domestic violence, that it was before seen as a husband's prerogative to beat his wife. So a lot of challenge to feminism in Latin America has been that success, that co-option by the state of feminist discourses. So what I think is important about thinking about indigenous rights is that one kind of right begins to regulate another. So even though the Mexican government said that the Zapatista rebellion could not possibly be indigenous because it has women's rights, after the Zapatistas negotiated the San Andres Peace Accords, it went to Congress, actually like a decade later, took a very long time, and they were going to vote on it. And when they voted on it, lots of different, Congress people in Mexico said, "We're sorry, we can't pass this Indian rights bill because it doesn't protect women's human rights within indigenous customary law." So you kind of have to go, what, right? So on the one hand, it's kind of a dual logic of racism, and gender is being used to regulate indigenous rights, right? So on the one hand, they're not indigenous because they believe in women's rights, and then on the other hand, when you're going to grant them their rights, the indigenous people can't have rights because they don't protect women. And what that erased is that for 10 years, indigenous women had been organizing within the indigenous movement and had been fiercely contesting and reconstructing different indigenous traditions and saying indigenous traditions aren't those traditions, right, that are stuck in the past in the Museum of Anthropology. They're traditions that are living and growing and can change, right? So, and it also homogenizes all the traditions, because some traditions are, like in that Zapotec region, is largely a matriarchal tradition, right? So it homogenizes every, indigenous culture to be the same culture, instead of recognizing that there's actually 63 different pueblos or indigenous peoples in Mexico, and they all have different kinds of gender arrangements and practices. So this is a kind of interesting thing about how rights discourse can be both emancipatory and regulatory, and we have to think about that our commitment to justice has to be holistic. We can't cleave off one kind of commitment to achieve another goal. I've seen this recently in asylum law, right? They finally said that gays and lesbians can seek asylum if they've been had violence based on sexual orientation in their countries of origin, which is great, right? But it's pretty fascinating that for transgender people, right? So to be transgender, that doesn't mean you're gay, right? It means you have a different gender presentation, right? So there's lots of men who used to be married to women who may transition to be women who stay with their wives, right? So suddenly they're lesbians, or are they straight because they've been married for 30 years? It's confusing, right? But it doesn't make them gay necessarily, right? It makes them gender nonconforming. And so we can see how this is operating in asylum law because they put all transgender people into gay and lesbian. And so as one kind of category gets its liberation, we see this in the LGBT movement when, you know, people want to talk about their status undocumented, and people are like, don't talk about that, just talk about the gay thing, right? And so we're thinking about how our liberation has to be holistic. We can't let one kind of liberation begin to regulate the other agenda. So that's one of the other lessons that I've learned. Also from the indigenous movement in Mexico, I've learned the concept of multi-scale activism, which is pretty amazing. So these are women who are the most marginalized people in their country, right? They're from the most marginalized economic group, they're from the most marginalized racial group, and within their racial and economic group, they're like the marginal of the most marginal, right? And so what I discovered, you know, hanging out with them for the last 15 years, is that they don't care, you know, that you're going to say they can't participate, because they'll be like, oh, so they'll be organizing in a national meeting, and then there'll be some blockage. Some guys will say, no, you know, you can't organize women's issues here. So then they'll go to the Continental Network of Indigenous Women and then decide to host a continental meeting in Mexico. And in order to do so, they have to form a national network of Indigenous women. That's the group I've been been studying with and working with for a long time. And so in order to do so, they have to form their national organization. And then they kind of shame their male counterparts by saying, well, you're not really on the same page with the international movement if you don't let us have our own national movement, right? And then in their home communities, right, a lot of indigenous communities are still run by consultation or consensus building in community assemblies. And some community assemblies, women have participated historically and some not. So the women in their city, you know, so locally, so they weave in between that transnational and the national, and they bring the national to the local by saying, well, if we don't get to participate, then you're kind of out of step with the national movement where other women are participating, right? So they weave between their local experiences to their national, to their transnational, and that multi-scale activism has been really important for including new women. Right, because sometimes we see activists who are, you know, superstars on the international level, but who are totally disconnected from their communities at home, or people who are still local heroes, but who nobody knows about nationally or internationally. Right, so their strategy is pretty interesting because it helps people move in between these scales, which helps create a way to leverage. So they leverage the little space they have at the national to create new spaces in the local. They create new spaces in the international and then leverage that against the national, right? And then they're able to use these spaces to create new collective identities together, new kinds of solidarity, new political discourses. And so this is important in thinking about different ways that people are thinking about transnational feminism. Okay, so I'm on my last lesson. Oh, the words are getting bigger, aren't they? Supposed to be getting smaller. But I want to tell you the story of some women farm workers in California. They organize in an organization called Líderes Campesinas, which means just simply women farm workers, right? And the interesting thing about this is that there's within the California agricultural sector, people predicted that by 2020, 20% of all agricultural workers would be indigenous. So people who are Mixtec or Fiqui from Mexico, from Oaxaca, right? And so what they didn't expect is that it's already not only 20% now, it's already 30%, right? So 30% of all the food, and California produces a lot of agriculture. So I think you all have a Central Valley here too. I think some Mixtecs are already here working your fields in New York. I've heard this. So that's in itself kind of interesting. But what I didn't really learn about until I went to interview and work with farm worker women in a collaborative ethnography they invited me to participate in is that indigenous farm workers get paid less than other farm workers, right? And they're stigmatized because oftentimes they don't speak Spanish and they don't speak English, right? So they speak Triqui, they speak Mixteco. So this is a really historic way that plantation owners in Hawaii and, have brought in Japanese, then Chinese, then Filipino, then other people who don't speak each other's language to do the divide and conquer thing, right? But in the case of Mexico, what's happening here is two different racial systems, and this is where that hybrid hegemonies comes in. So different racial hegemonies, right? So in Mexico, there is an anti-indigenous prejudice, right? Which is somewhat obscured because they have this national idea that everybody's mestizo, right? But you could tell they're not when you watch Univision and everybody's blonde, right? But then when you walk around the street and the people who are the poorest are indigenous, right? So clearly it's not like a racial democracy, and clearly, even though they're saying everybody's mixed, there's still a large amount of indigenous people in Mexico who aren't mixed, right? Who are indigenous. And that idea of mestizaje erases the fact that indigenous people still exist. They're not in the past, they're actually present people. And they actually happen to be the biggest population in the hemisphere, right? So Mexico has the largest indigenous population in the hemisphere. They're not the largest percent of the population in Mexico, like Guatemala, Peru. Other countries have their bigger percentages of their population, but they have the largest amount of indigenous people. So when people migrate, those systems of racial meaning migrate with them, right? So it happens that the foremen are other Mexican and Latino people who have that anti-indigenous hatred and prejudice that they've grown up with their whole lives, kind of inbred, right? And they're like, they don't need to make as much money, or hey, I can get over on them because they don't speak Spanish, right? They can't access health and resources the way we can. So what I started to learn is that system of race then got mapped onto how U.S. Latinos are treated in the U.S. anyway, and it started to hybridize, right? So hybrid hegemonies, even though that's a really complicated set of words, it simply means how one set of racial meanings and another set, one from Mexico, from the U.S., collide, and how they hybridize, right, in the process of migration. And then you add gender onto that, right? So not only do indigenous people make less than mestizos, women make less than men in the fields too, and not to mention the kind of gendered impact of pesticides, sexual harassment, all these other gendered issues. So this is how these two different systems of power are hybridizing because of globalization. And how did these people end up here in the first place, right? So why so many Mextecs now? Why all these people in Oaxaca now? Because they're from the very southern part. So if you think about Mexican migration historically, it used to be people from the northern states, like Puebla and Jalisco, right? And so it's pretty fascinating to think, why are they here now? So if we go back to NAFTA, right, in order to enter NAFTA, and the US and Mexico and Canada, when they made that agreement, part of free trade is to lower barriers to investment, foreign investment. And one of those blockages was the fact that Mexico had a legacy of the Mexican Revolution, which was the ejido system, or collective land tenure system. The fact that people still could collectively work the land and live off those, that produce, that product together as a community. And in order to enter NAFTA, the then Mexican president, Carlos Salinas de Gortari, had to dismantle the ejido system so that land could be privatized and could be, held by private landowners. And so that's why we have so many new immigrants, right? It's not, so people think about immigration as something that started at the, once people are here in the US, but we have to think of what are the policies, oftentimes that the US have already been involved in, that kind of engineers this process. People don't leave and risk their lives and cut all their, cut all their ties to their family and risk, violence, death, rape, to cross a border to come because, for the hell of it, they're coming because of these other sets of reasons. And so this is one of the lessons that I learned is that we're not just talking about our racial system now. We're talking about how our racial system has been globalized and how our racial system interacts with those who our economic policies have engineered to come here to the U.S. Okay, so this gets to, my favorite picture. The La Mujer Obrera. You heard of this organization, the Women Worker? It's in South Texas. And this is again kind of thinking about if we honored immigrant women's labor and thought about them as these transnational actors, we would see different histories and genealogies of the anti-globalization movement. So the anti-globalization movement, lots of people think that it started in 1998 with the battle in Seattle. You might be too young to remember that. But it was when protesters went to the WTO, the World Trade Organization meeting in Seattle, and people thought this is when the movement started because some white activists got really angry and they broke some Starbucks windows. The Starbucks is you don't even have a Starbucks over here, so it's not that urgent. But, maybe where you came from before you came here, there was Starbucks, but, it's a symbol of global domination, right? But the fact is if we only paid attention to that, we would miss these other histories, like La Mujer Obrera, or the other organization, Fuerza Unida, both two Texas Mexican women's organizations formed in 1987, that were women who were working and who were already displaced by globalization, who were displaced by the process of deindustrialization. So part of what all globalization is about, not just is free trade or deregulation, but it's also about shop flight, right? When some of you know this, if you're from Detroit or from Pittsburgh, or when all these industrial jobs go offshore, right? So this happened to this group of women, La Mujer Obrera, the women worker in South Texas, and they began to organize against what that looked like for them. And so if we're only paying attention to the battle in Seattle, we're not paying attention to what happened before that, what happened when women workers were displaced and began to organize. So some of what I've been talking about is a little bit depressing, all these cautionary tales, right? So what do we do about it? What do we do if we're people who want to live in a world with, social justice, with peace, with equality? If we're people who want to end colonialism or sexism or racism or heterosexism or all the isms, imperialism, right? So one of the lessons that I've learned is that we could become translingual. And I learned this from other sexual rights organizers, right? So to become translingual is to be able to learn each other's histories and be conversant in those histories, and to learn about different languages of liberation, right? Not to assume that our language, our script, our way of doing liberation is the best or the most dominant. It might be the only one we know about, right? So to become translingual is to incite new political projects by reworking international meanings into local contexts, right? Those ideas of localization that I was talking about, that the Third World Women's Alliance did, or the Hijas de Cuauhtémoc did. To be translingual is to translate ideas across international and transnational contexts, right, and make them appropriate for us. So I learned this from some of the Chicana and Latina women who went to that Marcha Lésbica in Mexico City, and then they decided to bring home their experiences and learning to Los Angeles. And I think Dr. Serna was one of the organizers of this tongue-to-tongue, this meeting between Mexican and Latin American organizers and Chicana Latina organizers. So what that required them to do is translate not just identities, but translate our identities into political visions and political projects. Because what I remember at one of those meetings was, someone said, well, this group in Mexico doesn't include bisexuals. I can't be in this revolution, I can't be in this movement. And instead of it translating our identities, we would have to translate what does that political vision of liberation look like in both spaces, right? It doesn't have to look like us or be like us. It doesn't have to be the same. But we have to have a shared agenda based on this ability to be translingual, to be multilingual liberation. And the third way, I think, to be translingual is to help us identify and translate identities and movement meanings across these translocal spaces without erasing differences. So this isn't to say that bisexual women are excluded or, whatever, but it is to say that if we are going to work together, that we don't have to have the same exact formations, but we have to be committed to the same political values, right, and ideas of social justice. So I want you to practice being translingua today and every day. It sounds a little kinky, but it's not. I mean, it could be if you wanted it to be, but you have to have fun. I think it was, right? Who's that person who said, if I can't dance, I don't want to be in your revolution? Do you know? Or Rosa Luxemburg, or one of those early anarchist women. Right? So I hope this is the idea that the transformational politics means that we have to be translinguals. We have to be able to practice multiple languages of liberation, multiple skills of translation across different scales, across different geographies, across different localities, right? And we have to be open to defining how our power relationships are shifting and how they're relational to other people. Because we might be the most oppressed people in the US, but once we travel somewhere else, we may become posited as the person who is bringing war to their country, right? Or posited in a geopolitical way as people who have more power, right? So how are we going to navigate those geographies of difference? So my idea is that we become translinguas. We own that privilege that we have, and we figure out how to translate what we're thinking about to how other people are thinking about. And take some of the arrogance, that we've had. I think sometimes we think about that as the U.S. we're the most liberated, or we've invented feminism, and maybe we have some really good ideas, but nobody will understand them if we don't become translinguals. Okay, so I want to stop there and then see if we have any questions or discussions. I think she's bringing the microphone in the back. There's a transition for classes.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so we're letting some transition of people between classes happen. The Q&A is the funnest part. It's not a monologue. Okay, so questions, ideas, comments? Yes.
Okay. Can you talk more about transnational feminism and why it isn't international feminism? Like what
That's an excellent question. I actually cut that from the talk. Okay, so I learned this distinction from a historian, Francisco Miller, who wrote about the early inter-American and feminist congresses that happened in the early 1900s. And she makes the distinction between transnationalism and internationalism. And internationalism are those spaces in which nation states are getting together, right? So the United Nations and those kinds of bodies. Transnationalism is spaces in which people who are often marginalized by nation states are trying to connect and organize, right? So when we talk about the international system, we're usually talking about the United Nations, right? But even when women organize, in all the UN World Conferences that we've had for women's rights and indigenous rights, it's not usually, it's the nation states that are meeting, but then the women come as part of the NGO forum. And so really that NGO forum is a non-governmental organization forum, or is a transnational space, not an international space. So that's the distinction between internationalism and transnationalism. Thank you for that question. Hi, Denise. could do yours.
I talk really
performance.
loud, so I worry about screaming into microphone. So I just want to say brilliant talk. Thank you so much for that. I'm really, I like this idea of transnational feminism because as you were talking, I can't help but to think about, like you said, about movements. We have this idea that movements are born in the U.S., you know, and they're just, yeah, and then they travel abroad. But so I was thinking about the Haitian Revolution and how the Haitian Revolution was situated, you know, the impact that it had on New Orleans, Louisiana, and how then that impacted a lot of Creoles in Louisiana and how they beat like the Civil War and like their civil rights movement and how that led to Plessy versus Ferguson. And yeah, so it's that. So I like this idea of like removing the map. So if we don't like talk about ideas and think about ideas in terms of like the United States and the Caribbean and then France, you know, and then just like take them out the map and then just think about ideas, that's really, really powerful. And I like this idea of being like translingual. Because when we, I feel like what frustrates me right now when we talk about feminism and feminism and, you know, activism and how do we bring up all these different movements together, they do start from this position of identity, you know, and not necessarily like ideas. And so you have one group over here, you have a group over here, and you say, well, I'm bisexual, or I'm black, or, you know, I'm the South, or I'm the North, you know, well, I'm not a worker, I am a worker, you know, I was an upper class. And so I guess I want to, there is a question here. so if we remove the map, right, and just start thinking, because as you were talking, you know how like on the weather maps, they have like the jet streams and they show like which way the jet stream is moving, you know. So we think about ideas not as like, oh, well, this started in California, this started in New York, you know, and this started in this part of Mexico, so that's why we're beefing, you know. So we think about it as like jet streams of knowledge and jet streams of ideas. Then how can we, like, in real life, you know, become translingual and, like, shift conversations from, like, you know, I feel like our obsession with identity politics and then move it more to, so, like, okay, yeah, I'm different, you're different, we have different backgrounds, but when we think about it, because as you were talking, when you think about migrant women, I think about, yeah, like, black women leaving plantations, you know, like migrating to different places, like in the South and in the North to get jobs as domestic workers, and then like the exploitation that they experience. So, like, it's a common theme here of oppression, and which goes back to capitalism, patriarchy, and all that. But how can we like become like translingual and move the conversation from identity to ideas?
Thank you for that question and those ideas, sharing, because I think you're right. I think, yeah, definitely, you know, how the Haitian Revolution inspired other kinds of rebellions of enslaved people, but how people also translated the idea of the Haitian Revolution into their own context, right? And made it real for them. So I don't know, yeah, the map is like a fiction in a way, right? It's the geopolitical fiction, but we fight over the border. I heard Trump's gonna build a new wall.
A bigger, better wall.
A bigger, better wall. That was all the problems. But if you're right, if we become translingual, we can see that, you know, LGBT liberation really started like Black Lives Matter. It started as a police riot, right? So what if we understood gay liberation as a fight against police brutality and the violence of the state, and the way in which that got enacted onto LGBT bodies? So in some ways identity doesn't matter, and then some ways it does really matter because it helps articulate the violence against people because they're Black, because they're LGBT. But if we weren't so wedded to, you know, Black Lives Matter, LGBT as two different things, we could understand that these are actually struggles that start about the same thing. They're about the same thing. They're about exactly the same thing. And that many LGBT struggles, even before Stonewall, were about police riots and police violence. And that doesn't take away our responsibility from saying Black lives do matter. Right? Because sometimes I think our tendency, I've heard lots of activists say, and so do Mexican lives, and so do whatever lives. And it's true, all lives matter. But what we're missing it's the opportunity to be in solidarity with a group and a movement that's really on fire right now, that's showing us something important, you know. So I think identity does get in the way, and then it also does the work of teaching or showing us something that we need to see. But I like your idea of the map and the flow, and to see how those flows of resistance or those flows of oppression touch us in different ways.
I'm also scared that I'm going to be really loud. But first of all,
Be loud.
First of all, on the idea of solidarity, actually, I wanted to recommend people. I don't know if anyone has heard of this movie Pride that came out in 2014. That is about the solidarity movement in the 1970s between the miners that were really affected by Thatcher's, yes, by Thatcher's policies, who went on strike for 2 years, and how the LGBTQ movement at the time came together with them. It's a really great tale of solidarity between workers' rights and LGBTQ rights. But what I want to try to...
Is it on Netflix? I think it is.
I'm not sure. But what I wanted to ask about is, while I was in Mexico, what I noticed is that a lot of women, so there's the whole sort of like, there's the Latina women's movement. But in Mexico, I noticed that a lot of women actually rejected the label of Latina and rejected the label of sort of like Latina feminists and wanted to identify themselves by their ethnic identity because they thought that Latina was a colonial construct, and they thought it was an artificial way of, uniting women transnationally. So, yeah, I was wondering if you could, I don't know, maybe speak a little bit of like the tensions or the between like indigenous women's movement and Latina.
Yeah, so I think you're both getting at the idea of what are the labels that we could use to connect ourselves to each other, and then what are the ways in which those labels, like women of color, erase the specificity. So yeah, Latino is only used in the U.S., right? And it's used largely against Hispanic, right? The idea, neither word is a very good word because Hispanic means you're from Spain, right? And Latino means you're Latin, right? Which just means that the Latin-speaking people conquered the Americas, so none of those are very good. But Latino is in some ways a little better because people have selected that to name themselves, whereas Hispanic is a governmental category that the government decided to call people. But it doesn't travel to Latin America because people consider themselves Mexican or from their state or from their pueblo or from their indigenous group. And that kind of reveals, one, that most Mexican feminists are part of a Latin American feminist kind of movement, and they would refer to themselves as Latin American before Latinos. That doesn't really make sense in their context. So most Latinos wouldn't become Latinos until they came to the U.S., right? Just like many immigrant women, third world women are not women of color until they come to the U.S., right? So context is specific, right? Just like if you are Indian or Jamaican, when you move to Britain, you become black, right? That's how that racial configuration works, even though black in our context means from Africa, right? So we have to be, this is our opportunity to be translinguists, to look at, okay, so these categories aren't traveling, and if we insisted on Latina or Latino, we would be reinscribing that global script of liberation that's putting our U.S. identity on other people, right? And not being attentive to that specific racial formation, that specific history, and also that colonial thing that happens, which is, I've been talking about indigenous people, but indigenous people weren't indigenous until Europeans came, right? They were Mohawk, they were Oneida, they are Zapotec, they're Mayan, and even within that, they're from their own regions or villages, or they're not, not every group is its own thing. They only get pitted that way when they're made the other, right? And so that's the tricky thing about identity again, right? So people are naming the way they've been made other, right? Just like the category lesbian doesn't really mean that much amongst lesbians. There are so many different kinds of lesbians, and some lesbians don't call themselves lesbians. They whether be queer or dyke or I don't know, so many other kinds of sexual rights, identities, different kinds of languages, right? Some people use those, some of it's generational, some of it's, really these labels are about naming the way people have been othered. But we get attached to it, right? Because it's powerful to name and reject the way we've been othered, right? So, yeah, I think it's a thing about respecting the way people want to be called. I don't trip when people want to be called a certain thing. I'm like, sure, let me call you that, because it's not up to me. It's certainly not up to me. So to be respectful in acknowledging the way people want to be called and how they see themselves, and then still to be a translingual, to try to translate different experiences and histories, and not to make those histories my histories or insist on my interpretation. Other ideas or questions? Hi. I want to walk up like this.
Hi. I like both the ideas that you introduced to the unaligned geographies and translingua. And I keep thinking about translingua because there's like, growing literature on the ideas of translation, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this is from a different take on a lot of the literature. And kept thinking about it in relation to what Anna has been talking about. I don't know if you...
In her latest book? I read her first book.
Well, the book she has on transnational activism around, particularly in relation to Indonesia and around the environment. And one of the things that she's bringing up, and I kept thinking about here, how does that work here, is about the flow of money, right? And how even in translation, right, the ability to translate or to enter into these translational discourses is also dependent on the way in which money flows and power flows through those categories of money. So I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit to that, like has there been, what kind of organizing, right? Because she's talking about NGOs, and some of these structures that we're talking about are through NGOs, and some of them seem like they're not. They're just so very community level grassroots, but there isn't that kind of NGO infrastructure. And does that make a difference, do you think, in the ability to make translations?
Yeah, I think you're really right on the money. So the idea of translinguist comes out of a chapter that I have in this book called, I don't know, we kept calling it Translocas. I think it's called it's called Translocalities, the Latin American Feminist Politics of Translation. And the reason why I got interested in this idea of geographies of difference in the first place was because everybody began to pay attention to the most visible NGOs. And the most visible NGOs are the people who can access a visa, a fax machine, an email account, right? So what I was noticing when I was doing my dissertation work in the 90s was that that transnational feminism and transnational organizing and international NGOs were replicating the existing power relationships, right? And so in order to be visible or to be translated were people who already had relative privilege, right? And so even among Indigenous women's organizers, there are sectors that get NGOized, right? And then there are sectors who try to remain pretty grassroots and stay connected, but they still have to be able to translate themselves to even women's NGOs to access money. But what I noticed, which is really fascinating, is that a lot of the women's NGOs in Mexico for Indigenous women are oriented around leadership development. And a lot of feminist NGOs are really, they develop a kind of model that's very individualistic. So you think leadership training, that sounds great, right? But leadership training is really based on developing one individual to become empowered and to be a leader, instead of and it disrupts a little bit ideas about Indigenous collectivity, Indigenous decision making, So it's an interesting logic, right? On the one hand, it does help when women learn to, speak in public, access a fax machine, do all those things. And on the other hand, it makes a movement like other movements so that it can be translated. So I think you're right. It's exactly one of the issues. Yeah. And in this translinguas, this tongue to tongue, one of the reason why I picked this case is because some of the things weren't translatable. Like this was, in Mexico, this was a lesbian feminist movement that they were separatists. So they didn't want to organize with trans people. They didn't want to organize with bisexual people. And that kind of rubbed against the organizers they were meeting, which were a lot of women of color who were, part of an emerging trans movement or trans-friendly movement. And the kind of women of color feminist politics that had really worked to be more open were meeting a group that was much more separatist. And so without thinking about why, the histories of why that group became more autonomous, as they would call it, not separatist, versus why women of color, who actually have a lot of autonomous politics, but without being able to translate each other, things kept falling apart. Right? So that's how my idea of translingua came, which is translating histories and why people become particular kinds of actors. And I could respect that. I mean, if I lived there, I might be like that too, even though it's a politic in the US I always say I'm against. But I couldn't say that if I lived there, I wouldn't think that made a lot of sense.
I was wondering if you could talk more about feminist research practices and sort of a little bit about the problems and ethics that you had to navigate coming into, for instance, the indigenous feminist.
Where do I start? Okay, yeah, that's such a good question. It's a really big one.
Yeah.
So there's this thing about feminist research methods, right? That people try to talk about what are the power relationships between women. And early feminist methods were like, hey, we're all women, it's cool, right? And then more, in the last few decades have been more attentive to the power relationships, which are very complicated. So, as a person coming from the US, working in Mexico, there's that kind of relationship and privilege. But what I found out is I'm not a white woman coming from the US, and so that makes things a lot different. So I started actually in women's studies programs and feminist programs. And what I realized is, even though the indigenous movement had started, feminism in Mexico hadn't grappled with indigenous ideas or race. Like most feminists in Mexico of that class, of academic class, only knew indigenous women as their maids, to be honest. And so I had a really hard time trying to figure out how to access or be in conversation with the movement. It took me a long time. And then when I was there, I realized I worked a lot differently. So I would, I was in my 20s, I began to haul the beans, make the Xeroxes, do all the work, right? Because that's how I know how to organize and how to work. And that gave me a lot of, access and helped me build friendships and trust with people. But I noticed when other academics came through, they would come for the meeting and take off, right? And I kept going, I couldn't understand really why. But to them, the power relationships are much clearer. Even mestizas there could even have brown skin, but the class distinction is so radical. So it made me really understand, we have affirmative action, right? So I'm coming from a working class background into a working class background, or even people who were probably more impoverished than working class people in the US. But there is a kind of ethic and work ethic that helped me to translate to be in their world. And it's stunning. The class stuff is really stunning in different contexts, because in the US we pretend like we don't have class, we don't have class, and other places class really matters. Another thing about methodology that was really interesting is I was trained by that kind of first generation of feminist oral historians, to do life history. And I was trained by Serna, and she did all these histories with suffragette women and women in Palestine, and she's really amazing. But when I went to Mexico and I would ask, when were you born? People were like, I don't know. Right? Because they're born in a rural context, they don't have birth certificates. And so just starting with when were you born or what is your age, like it kind of reveals a linear narrative that doesn't relate to people's experience. So I had to learn how to do life history in a different way that wasn't linear. So even when we're learning kind of the best feminist methods here in the U.S., when you get to where you're going to work, just be open to it change. Actually, I had a totally different project. I went to study second wave women's organ. I was a historian before this. I wasn't a so when I went there, the indigenous movement was kind of on fire, and they kind of started to take over my project and my life. So I've done it for 20 years now, which is amazing. So being open, if you really are open to working with community, that community might change your research. And that's a good thing. Did you have a question? Or?
It was going to be like what Tony asked about, methods. What it was like the company's differences, so you talked about that. Maybe like what were some other challenges that you had in terms of
Well, so when I first went to Mexico, I was going to write about ideas of differences in women's organizing, and I was going to work with the lesbian movement. And every time I would go, it would fracture again. So this autonomous feminism and lesbian feminism was an idea that was really important, but every time it kept getting more and more pure, so fewer and fewer people existed in that group. And so it's like how to tell a story of a movement that seems to be disintegrating. Like every time I would return, people who used to be allies were now enemies, like crazy enemies, like totally enemies. And like how, and is that a story you want to tell at that moment? So how to tell a story, like it's useful to make, because the critique of autonomy, or the use of autonomy is really important. Indigenous movements use it to mean kind of ideas of sovereignty, what we would refer to as sovereignty here. But within feminism in Latin America, autonomy meant, it came out around the time of Beijing, around the World Conference, to mean autonomous from international funding, not to be, have your organization dictated by the mandates of the Ford Foundation, for example. So it was a really important critique, but it became so purist that after a while there could only be like one truly autonomous feminist and one, so trying to tell that story while that was happening was difficult. And if I told it, I would probably lose a lot of friends. But at the same time, I think it's important to point out that a political discourse could become so purist that it becomes not useful, and so how to have that conversation, I think takes years of respect, right? Because then it becomes like, oh, here you come from the north to tell us how to do our movements, or having, conversations. I was on the board of the International Lesbian Gay Rights Commission, Lesbian Gay Rights Commission, IGLHR. And at the time in Latin America, they were doing really great work in South America with the transgender movement, but in Mexico, it was really seen as a kind of imperial arm. So that was hard too, because I believed in gay and lesbian and transgender, that configuration didn't translate well in that context. So thinking about how to be in conversation about what I believe to be true and still respect where people came from, I think, and still have friendships after that. Is really about what I was mentioning before, is respecting their history and the way they're doing their movement makes sense to them. I might not agree with it, but I'm not living in their shoes, right? And so knowing when to say, I really disagree with you, and this is why, but that doesn't mean I hate you, or, whatever. But I mean, it does structure what you've already hit on, is that it does structure funding opportunities and who gets a certain kind of visibility, and who becomes kind of an international darling, and in research start places, this is really important. Who gets that visibility is really important. So those are complicated questions, and that your research lends a visibility. Your research lends a visibility to that. Thank you.
It's great, and we'll be around if you all want to just talk more informally and ask questions. But thanks for staying to for the Q&A.